The Midnight Caller. Chapter 1. The First Ring. The night was thick with an unsettling stillness as Detective Sarah Grayson sat at her desk. The soft hum of the precinct's lights the only sound that filled the air. She had seen her fair share of gruesome cases, but this one felt different. The kind that gnawed at you long after the case file was closed. Her phone buzzed on the desk, a late-night call from a colleague she wasn't expecting. Grayson answered it, her voice firm despite the fatigue. "Grayson here. Sarah, it's Jenkins. We've got another one." The voice on the other end was tense, each word heavy with urgency. Jenkins was her partner, a seasoned detective who rarely lost his cool. For him to sound this rattled set her on edge. "Where?" she asked, already grabbing her coat. "Same as the others. Victim received a call just after midnight. Voice on the other end gave them 20 minutes to live. The police arrived too late, again." The familiar rush of adrenaline pushed away the tiredness. This was the fourth victim in as many weeks, and the killer's taunting phone calls had become a grim signature. Grayson could feel the knot tighten in her stomach, a sign she had learned not to ignore. The killer was escalating, and she feared what would happen if they didn't catch him soon. She drove through the deserted streets, her mind racing through the details of the previous cases. Each victim had received a call at midnight, each one had pleaded for their life, and each time the police had arrived just minutes too late. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing but the echo of a chilling voice over the phone. Grayson arrived at the scene, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the rain-slicked pavement. She approached the familiar sight of officers cordoning off the area, their faces etched with the same frustration she felt. Jenkins met her at the edge of the tape, his expression grim. "This one's bad, Sarah," he said, leading her toward the body. "The guy's getting more vicious." The victim, a woman in her 30s, lay on the ground, her face twisted in terror. The sight was haunting, but what caught Grayson's attention was the phone lying next to her hand, the screen still lit. The call had been disconnected just moments before the police arrived. She crouched down, careful not to disturb the scene, and picked up the phone. The call log showed the time, 12:01 a.m., the same time as the others. "Same number?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Yeah," Jenkins replied, rubbing the back of his neck. "Untraceable as usual. We've got tech on it, but it's like chasing a ghost." Grayson stood up, her mind working through the possibilities. This killer was meticulous, always staying one step ahead. But everyone made mistakes, and she was determined to find his. "We need to talk to the families again," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "There has to be something we're missing. Some connection between them." Jenkins nodded, though his eyes held a flicker of doubt. "You think we'll find it this time?" Grayson didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked back at the victim, her heart heavy with the weight of the case. "We have to, Jenkins, before he strikes again." The night stretched on as they worked through the details, but in the back of her mind, Grayson knew that time was running out. The Midnight Caller wasn't just playing a game, he was winning it. And unless they found him soon, the cost would be more lives lost to his sadistic whims. She just hoped they wouldn't be too late. Chapter 2. The Silent Connection. The investigation into the Midnight Caller's latest victim was relentless. Detective Grayson spent the next few days poring over phone records, interviewing the victim's friends and family, and revisiting every clue they had. But as the hours turned into days, the frustration grew. Each lead fizzled out, leaving them back at square one. Grayson's desk was cluttered with files, each one a reminder of the lives the killer had taken. She studied the faces in the photos, hoping that something, anything, would jump out at her. But the killer was careful, leaving no trace behind. It was as if he knew exactly how to cover his tracks. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Jenkins stepped into her office, his expression a mix of determination and concern. "Got something?" he said, holding up a small baggie. Inside was a scrap of paper, worn and crumpled. Forensics found this at the scene. It was stuffed under the victim's fingernail. Grayson took the bag, her pulse quickening. "What does it say?" "Looks like part of a phone number," Jenkins replied. "But it's incomplete. We're running it through the database, but it's a long shot." Grayson examined the paper closely. It was a small piece, barely legible, but it was more than they had before. This could be his number, she mused. Maybe the victim tried to write it down before she didn't finish the sentence, the implication hanging heavy in the air. The victim had fought back, tried to leave a clue for them. It was the first sign that the killer might have slipped up. But why leave it? Jenkins asked, his brow furrowed. Why not make sure it was destroyed? Grayson considered this. The midnight caller had been meticulous so far, never leaving any evidence behind. But if this was his number, then it meant he was getting careless or cocky. Maybe he thought he was untouchable, that the police would never catch up to him. Or maybe he wants us to find him, Grayson said quietly. Jenkins looked at her, confused. You think he's baiting us? It's possible, she replied, setting the bag down. He's been playing with us this whole time, leading us on. Maybe he wants to see how close we can get before he pulls the rug out from under us. The thought was chilling, but it made sense. The killer had been toying with them from the start, calling his victims and leaving them just enough time to know they were going to die. It was a sick game, and now it seemed he was dragging the police into it. We need to find out where that number leads, Grayson said, her mind racing. If it's his, it could be our first real break. Jenkins nodded, already pulling out his phone to make the call. As he stepped out to contact the tech team, Grayson leaned back in her chair, the weight of the case pressing down on her. The midnight caller was taunting them, daring them to get closer. But with each step they took, the danger grew. And in the back of her mind, a voice whispered that they might not all make it out of this game alive. The midnight caller. Chapter 3. The voice on the line. The investigation took a sudden and chilling turn when the tech team finally traced the partial phone number. It led them to a prepaid burner phone, purchased anonymously weeks before the first murder. The trace was a dead end in terms of identification, but it did provide one vital clue. The phone had been used just once more after the last murder, and it had made a call to the police. Grayson sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, the phone resting on the metal table in front of her. Jenkins had the audio queued up, ready to play. The call had come in at 12:05 a.m., just minutes after the police had arrived at the last crime scene. The voice on the other end was eerily calm. "Ready?" Jenkins asked, his finger hovering over the play button. Grayson nodded, her nerves taut. She had a feeling that this call would reveal more about their elusive killer than any of the previous evidence. Jenkins pressed play, and the room filled with the sound of the midnight caller's voice. "Hello, Detective Grayson," the voice said, smooth and mocking. "I see you're getting closer, but not close enough." Grayson's blood ran cold. The killer knew her name. He was watching them, toying with them. "You should really hurry," the voice continued. "Time is ticking and I've got another call to make soon. But don't worry, I'll give you a fair chance, if you can figure out where I'll be next." The call ended with a click, the silence in the room almost deafening in its finality. Grayson stared at the phone, her mind reeling. The killer had spoken directly to her, taunted her, and then vanished into the night. He was more than just a step ahead, he was dictating the game. Jenkins cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "He's playing us, Sarah. He's trying to get inside your head." "I know," she replied, her voice tight. "But why? What's his endgame?" Jenkins shook his head, his frustration palpable. "Could be anything. Maybe he's just a sadist enjoying the power trip. Or maybe there's something more to it." Grayson couldn't shake the feeling that there was a deeper motive behind the midnight caller's actions. He wasn't just killing for the thrill, there was a method to his madness. But what was it? And why her? "We need to go public with this," Jenkins said, his tone firm. "Warn people to be on the lookout, maybe someone will recognize the voice." Grayson hesitated. It was a risky move, one that could push the killer into hiding or drive him to escalate even further. But it was also their best shot at getting a lead. "Do it," she finally said, "but keep the details tight. We can't afford to tip him off that we're onto something." As Jenkins left to organize the press release, Grayson remained in the interrogation room, her thoughts swirling. The midnight caller had made this personal. He knew who she was and he was watching her every move. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She picked up the phone again, replaying the call in her mind. There was something in his voice, a hint of satisfaction that unnerved her. He was enjoying this, savoring every moment of their hunt. But Grayson was determined to turn the tables. She wouldn't let him win, wouldn't let him claim another victim. The game had changed, and now it was her turn to make a move. The only question was whether she could do it before the midnight caller made his next deadly phone call. Chapter 4. The Trap. The press conference was a calculated move, designed to flush out any potential witnesses or connections. Detective Grayson stood before the cameras, her face composed but her mind racing. The police department had decided to keep the details of the midnight caller's taunts to a minimum, focusing instead on warning the public to be vigilant. As the conference ended, Grayson's phone buzzed in her pocket. She checked the screen, a blocked number. Her pulse quickened as she answered, half expecting the sinister voice of the midnight caller. Detective Grayson. The voice on the other end was male, but not the one she had feared. "This is Lieutenant Anderson from the surveillance unit. We've got something you need to see." Relief mixed with curiosity as she listened to Anderson's explanation. They had placed the location of the last murder under close surveillance, hoping that the killer might return to the scene. It was a long shot, but it had paid off. "We've got footage of someone near the site about an hour after your press conference," Anderson continued. "It's grainy, but it's the best lead we've had." Grayson didn't waste any time. She drove to the surveillance unit, her mind racing with the possibilities. If they had footage of the killer, it could be the break they needed to finally identify him. When she arrived, Anderson led her to a small room filled with monitors. The footage was already queued up, a black and white image showing the area around the crime scene. The timestamp indicated it was just after 1 a.m. There, Anderson pointed to a shadowy figure moving in the background, partially obscured by the trees. The figure was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and seemed to be deliberately avoiding the cameras. Grayson leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing as she studied the figure's movements. "Can you zoom in?" Anderson adjusted the controls, but the image remained frustratingly blurry. Still, there was something about the way the figure moved, a certain fluidity that struck her as familiar. "Whoever it is, they know how to avoid being seen," Anderson said, his tone grim. "But we've enhanced the footage as much as possible. There's a brief moment where the face is partially visible." He played the clip again, slowing it down until the figure turned slightly, revealing a glimpse of their face. It was brief, no more than a second, but it was enough for Grayson to catch a faint, indistinct profile. "Run it through facial recognition," she ordered, her mind already racing with the implications. If they could match the face to someone in the system, it could lead them directly to the killer. Anderson nodded, already working on the task. "It'll take some time, but we'll get on it right away." Grayson thanked him and left the surveillance unit, her thoughts churning. The midnight caller was slipping, becoming bolder, and more careless. It was a sign that he might be feeling the pressure, that he was starting to lose control. But that also made him more dangerous. A cornered predator was always the most lethal, and Grayson knew that if they didn't catch him soon, the next body they found could be even more gruesome. As she drove back to the precinct, her phone rang again. She answered it without checking the screen, her mind still on the footage. Detective Grayson, the familiar, cold voice on the other end sent a jolt of fear through her. Enjoying the show? Her breath caught in her throat. The midnight caller had been watching her, just as she had been watching him. And now it seemed he was ready to up the stakes. "I told you, detective," the voice continued, "you're getting closer. But remember, I'm always one step ahead. I hope you're ready for the next round." The call ended with a click, leaving Grayson staring at the road ahead, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. The game was escalating, and now it was clear. Only one of them would come out alive. The midnight caller. Chapter 5. The Ultimatum. The precinct was a hive of activity as the team scrambled to process the new information. The surveillance footage had provided a tantalizing glimpse of their suspect, but it wasn't enough to make an arrest. Grayson paced the room, her mind running through every possibility. The midnight caller had made it clear that he was watching them, and his latest taunt suggested that he had something planned, something big. Jenkins entered the room, his expression tense. "We got a hit on the facial recognition, but it's not as clear-cut as we hoped." Grayson stopped pacing, her eyes locking onto Jenkins. What do you mean? It's a partial match, he explained, holding out a file. The system flagged it as a potential match to a man named Daniel Wells. Problem is, Wells died 2 years ago in a car accident. Grayson frowned as she took the file, flipping through the pages. The photo of Daniel Wells stared back at her, a young man in his late 20s with a clean-cut appearance. The resemblance to the figure in the footage was undeniable, but the fact that Wells was dead complicated things. You're saying our killer is using a dead man's identity? She asked, piecing it together. Jenkins nodded. It's possible. We've seen it before, people who steal identities to cover their tracks. If Wells is our guy, or at least someone connected to him, it could explain why he's been so hard to trace. Grayson considered this, her mind spinning with the implications. If the killer was using Wells' identity, it meant he had access to personal information, possibly even a connection to Wells before his death. But why? And how did it all tie back to the murders? We need to dig into Wells' background, Grayson said, her determination renewed. Friends, family, anyone who might have a connection to him. If we can find out who's behind this, we might be able to stop the next murder. Jenkins agreed, and the team quickly set to work, pulling up everything they could find on Daniel Wells. It was a tedious process, combing through old records, but they eventually uncovered something that made Grayson's blood run cold. Wells had been a tech genius, specializing in telecommunications. Before his death, he had been working on a project for a private security firm, one that focused on developing advanced, untraceable communication devices. This is it, Grayson muttered, staring at the screen. This is how he's been making the calls. Jenkins looked over her shoulder, his eyes widening as he read the report. If he had access to that kind of tech, he could be virtually invisible. And deadly, Grayson added. But why use it to kill? What's his motive? The question hung in the air, unanswered. The team continued their research, uncovering more about Wells' life and the people he had worked with. But as the hours passed, one name kept coming up, a former colleague named Evan Kerrigan, who had disappeared shortly after Wells' death. Grayson's gut told her they were onto something. Kerrigan had been close to Wells, a partner in his projects, but after the car accident, he had vanished without a trace. It was possible that Kerrigan had assumed Wells' identity, using his skills to become the Midnight Caller. Get me everything on Kerrigan, Grayson ordered. If he's our guy, we need to find him before he strikes again. As they dug deeper into Kerrigan's background, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Kerrigan had a history of mental instability, and after Wells' death, he had been committed to a psychiatric facility, only to escape a few months later. Of course, Grayson said, more to herself than anyone else. He blames Wells for something. Maybe for the accident. Maybe for ruining his life. And now, he's using Wells' identity to get revenge. Jenkins glanced at her, concern etched on his face. If Kerrigan's unstable, there's no telling what he'll do next. Grayson knew he was right. Kerrigan was unraveling, and with each murder, he was growing bolder. The Midnight Caller wasn't just killing at random. He was on a mission. And unless they stopped him, that mission would end with a lot more bloodshed. The thought barely had time to settle before Grayson's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She froze as she saw the blocked number, a chill running down her spine. Detective Grayson, she answered, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Good evening, Detective. The Midnight Caller's voice was calm, almost pleasant. I see you've been doing your homework. You're getting very close. But I'm afraid your time is up. Grayson's heart pounded in her chest. Where are you? The caller chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. Oh, Detective, you should know by now that I'm always nearby. But don't worry, I'll give you one last chance to catch me. After all, it's no fun if the game ends too soon. What do you want? Grayson demanded, her grip tightening on the phone. Simple, he replied, his voice turning cold. Meet me tonight, alone, at the old Wells property. Midnight, of course. Let's see if you're as good as you think you are. The line went dead before Grayson could respond. She stared at the phone, her mind racing. The Wells property, the place where Daniel Wells had lived before his death. The Midnight Caller was luring her into a trap, and she knew it. But there was no other choice. This was their best chance to stop him, to end the nightmare once and for all. She just hoped she wouldn't be walking into her own grave. Chapter 6. The Final Call. The drive to the Wells property was shrouded in darkness, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. Grayson's heart pounded as she approached the dilapidated house, its silhouette a stark contrast against the night sky. The place had been abandoned since Wells' death, left to decay along with the memories of its former occupant. She parked her car a short distance away, her hand instinctively resting on the grip of her service weapon as she scanned the surroundings. The air was thick with tension, each shadow seeming to shift and move as she approached the front door. The Midnight Caller had chosen this place deliberately, a site filled with personal history and a deep connection to his twisted game. The door creaked open with a push, revealing a dark interior that smelled of mold and neglect. Grayson stepped inside, her senses on high alert. The house was silent, save for the distant drip of water from a leaking pipe. She could feel the weight of the past pressing in on her, as if the walls themselves held the secrets she was searching for. Detective Grayson, the familiar voice echoed from somewhere deep within the house, chilling her to the bone. Welcome to the final act. Grayson's heart raced as she moved further into the house, her weapon drawn. The voice had come from upstairs, the sound bouncing off the walls in an eerie reverberation. She cautiously ascended the staircase, each creak of the wood underfoot amplifying the tension. Come now, don't keep me waiting, the caller's voice taunted, closer now. She reached the landing, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the flicker of light beneath a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, a faint glow emanating from within. Grayson steeled herself, every nerve on edge as she approached the door. Pushing it open with her foot, she entered the room, her eyes immediately locking onto the figure standing by the window. The man was tall, dressed in dark clothing, his face hidden in shadow. He turned slowly to face her, and Grayson's breath caught as she recognized the features. Evan Kerrigan. Kerrigan, she said, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her. It's over. Put your hands where I can see them. Kerrigan smiled, a twisted, almost serene expression. Over? No, detective. It's only just begun. Before she could react, Kerrigan raised his hand, revealing a small device in his palm. Grayson's eyes widened as she realized what it was. A trigger wired to something hidden in the room. Don't, she warned, her weapon trained on him. But Kerrigan's smile only widened. Too late, he whispered, pressing the button. The explosion that followed was deafening, the force of it throwing Grayson off her feet and slamming her into the wall. The room erupted in flames and debris, the heat intense and suffocating. Grayson struggled to stay conscious, her ears ringing as she tried to push herself up. But through the chaos, she could see Kerrigan standing unharmed, the flames licking around him but not touching. He looked down at her, his expression one of cold satisfaction. Goodbye, detective, he said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. You were a worthy opponent. With that, he turned and disappeared into the flames, leaving Grayson to fight for her life. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Grayson forced herself to her feet, the world spinning around her. She staggered toward the door, the heat from the fire searing her skin. The house was coming down around her, the walls collapsing as the fire consumed everything in its path. She barely made it out in time, collapsing onto the grass outside as the house exploded behind her, sending a shockwave that knocked her flat. Grayson gasped for air, her body trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. Kerrigan was gone, and with him, the secret of the Midnight Caller. But Grayson knew this wasn't over. She had survived, and as long as she was alive, she would hunt him down. He had won this round, but the game wasn't finished. Not yet.